Welcome to the Mini Sculpting Super Show, a place where you'll learn all about sculpting your very own miniatures. Well, I'm your host, Tom Mason, and today's topic is one of the most highly requested topics that I ever get, and that's sculpting guns. And this will probably be the first part in, I guess, a series, you'd call it, and because we're gonna start with pistols, sculpting pistols. We're gonna start with the small ones, the easy ones. Because this is actually one of the biggest things that I struggle with sculpting is sculpting these guns, and it's not because it's necessarily difficult, but I just don't like it as much. I like doing organic shapes, even with armor. I just like doing the whole form of a miniature and the character. But a very important part of that is sculpting all the equipment and accessories that go along with it. And what's more important in a miniature war game than dude's weapons? So that's what we're going to work on today. So let's get started. The Mini Sculpting Super Show is powered in part by Sculpt Toys. See everything they have to offer at sculptomotoys.com. First thing you need when sculpting a pistol is a piece of wire. For me, I like to use brass wire from KS Precision Metals. This particular size is 0.032 inches or 0.81 millimeters. I find this is a good size for most weapons when you don't need it to be extra thin and you want to kind of let the wire be a little bulkier, just right then and there. It's good for all sorts of weapons and different applications. So the length you'll want is also just going to be dependent on the type of pistol you're doing. If it's a really short snub nose type thing, then it can be a little smaller than others. But in this case, I had a longer barrel, so I left that a little longer. And then what I'm doing here is I'm just bending it into shape to kind of get a good starting point going for it. And then you have a little extra there that you can clamp on there and on a hemostat, I believe is what that clamp that I'm using is called. And that's just kind of basically pliers that will lock shut. Gives you something more to hold on to than a little tiny piece of wire. And it seems to hold the pistol in place better than if you were to slip it into a sculpting block. Alright, so once you've got your wire set up and done, you can also make the barrel wire a little longer too, I should say, and it's better to leave it a little longer than too short, because you can always trim it off. But I had pre-measured it, so I knew what length I needed it to be. And I'm just adding on this first layer of putty, just kind of skinning the wire, very much like you would do if you were sculpting an entire miniature. But in this case, rather than simply roughly putting the putty onto the wire, I'm actually taking a little bit of time to sculpt and form it a little more into shape. You can specifically see that on the handle grip there. And then, whereas the down the barrel, it's a little more, just straight skinning. But you want to make sure it's nice and smooth and even. And then I'm gonna add on a little more bulk here. And if you aren't comfortable with moving right onto this, you can let your putty cure. That's the coolest thing about doing this, is that you don't have to work it all at once like you would if this was FIMO. And I should say that right now, I'm going to use for this tutorial mainly Greenstuff and ProCreate. It's typically how I sculpt all of my guns, swords, weapons, basically any sort of separately sculpted bit that I need to attach to my characters. I typically use putty, and it's just because I know it's going to be nice and durable, and I can do extra sanding, and there's just a little more leeway with that in my mind. But you could absolutely try and sculpt this out of FIMO and just have to cook it afterwards, and it might be a little tricky in some spots, but that's right. So for this, what I did, I'm using my basic Greenstuff mix of I think for this I did about a little less than 50-50 Greenstuff and Aves Apoxie Sculpt. And the reason I do that is for two reasons. The Aves will make the the Greenstuff cure a little bit faster, and it will cure much harder, which makes it much easier to sand and file, as you'll see us do later on in the tutorial. So basically, what you want to do at this stage, and because a pistol is a smaller weapon, you can afford to like just add little bits and make slight little modifications rather than having everything flattened out and doing tons of chiseling and filing. You can do a lot of this on the fly. But as you'll see as we go on, we're going to rough this into shape, and then once we get this down, I will do a little bit of sanding and refining once this gets cured, because you can go pretty far, but you don't want to go too far in one go on a pistol, because if you do, you'll start to see some of those larger areas that aren't right directly on the wire. They can start to move and fluctuate, and you don't want that. Now that you have your basic shape finished and you've set the piece off to cure, you can use a putty oven or just leave it alone for a couple hours. Go ahead and go back in and file things down. You can sometimes get it pretty crisp just by using the clay shaper and your other tools, but I find that just a little refinement can be very helpful at this point, just to kind of square things up, take off a little bit of the rough edges, things like that. And I'm just using typical needle files, and here I decided that I actually wanted this main portion of the gun to be trimmed back just a little bit, so I was cutting a little off with the scalpel. But just work your way around it, do little refinements. Don't take too much off unless you put it on too thick and you need it to be thinner, because you want to have enough material there for when we're going to add on all the various extra details. And in fact, in this case, I probably could have put on a little more putty at the very beginning on the barrel part, as you'll see, because I end up adding on some more elements to this on the barrel, kind of making it more of a sci-fi pistol than what you would see in a typical Western. This is where you'll spend the majority of your time sculpting the gun. It's pretty quick, obviously, to bend the wire into place and then to get the basic shape bulked out. But here you're going to need to add on lots of little bits, and you might have to set the piece aside, let them cure, trim them down, file them down, or if you've set up enough of a base understructure, then you can do quite a lot at once. But if you end up having to do like different panels on the gun that overlap, then it can be a lot easier to do one panel at a time. For instance, right here, I'm sculpting the cylinder, and I decided to do this as two separate pieces on the side afterwards, rather than creating like the actual cylinder to begin with on top of the wire and then adding bulking on top of that afterwards. I could have done that, but this way was a little quicker, and it would still come across and read as a cylinder, even though it wouldn't be perfectly round and probably perfectly proportioned. It's a little wider than it would be if it were in real life, or if I had sculpted it the way that I was talking about. But anyways, my point is, if I ended up wanting to sculpt something on top of that, like say an extra guard that would wrap around it or something, some decorative piece like that, then I would probably set this aside, let it cure, and then go back over with more putty later, because it'd just be too easy to damage that fragile detail that I need to stay nice and crisp and well formed. And at this phase too, it doesn't matter, you can continue using Greenstuff, but I decided to switch to ProCreate for a couple reasons. One, I thought it'd be easier for you to see what I was adding on, and two, I actually prefer to sculpt with ProCreate putty when I'm doing my more detail work and whatnot. Now, I still add in the Aves Apoxie Sculpt along with it, do 25 to 50% of ratio, so I guess that would be a 1-to-1 or a 2-to-1, where you have always where I usually have more putty to the Aves, but you can add more Aves if you like that feeling, but it will make the putty a lot softer. And again, I did it just because it's the way I prefer my putty when I'm sculpting, and and in this case especially, it will make it a lot easier to file things down, which if you are very, very careful and precise at this point, you can get away without doing much, if any, filing. But I need to do a little bit, but not too much at the very end. Now you'll see what I'm talking about, how I'm adding on a little bit of putty on the top that kind of made the top to bottom thickness of the barrel, the shaft area of the pistol a little wider, a little taller, and I probably should have done that in the initial bulking stage when I was working on the pistol, but I kind of changed what I wanted to do with it in midstream. But it had an added benefit because I'm doing it as two pieces. What I ended up doing is I ended up kind of leaving a bit of a defined line between the gray ProCreate putty on the top and the center Greenstuff putty, which make up the actual barrel of the gun itself. Whereas this other part is more like decorative. As far as form, obviously, it's not anything super beautiful or anything like that. But it's necessary for the form, and I really like how it ended up turning out. Reminds me a little bit of the pistols that Vash the Stampede uses in Trigun, which I've always really liked, those really big, heavy revolvers, and that's kind of what I was going for. Now here's a good example of just adding a little bit of putty onto your base form to create a panel. So this is just a little bit of putty I'm adding on the handle portion that I'm going to trim in, so you'll kind of have a bit of a relief coming off the gun, and it just creates a little more sense of style, a little more interesting shape, so it's not just a flat, smooth element. And that's the main kind of thing that you can do on pistols to add just a little bit more extra detail. And it doesn't have to just be on the handle, but if you can, that's a great place to add that detail, because you have a lot more functionality happening down the barrel at times, and so you can feel free to embellish. You could cut in a texture to give it more of that crisscross diamond shape, that would simulate how just to add more friction when you're holding a pistol, or you can leave it smooth. These are miniatures, so can't always put in every single detail. Well, you can, but you don't necessarily need to. But if you want to, go ahead. All right, I'm going back in. This is all still, I haven't let any of this putty dry, and I'm just going back in, and I'm just pressing in to those cylinder pieces a little bit to kind of create those grooves you would see in a cylinder that kind of delineate where each shell would be, the space between where the shells are. And just to add a little more interest, and designed that, kind of cutting it down, trimming it. Now at this point, it would have been several minutes, so the putty is setting up a little more, and I love that. And this is a fresh batch I'm actually sticking on that I mixed up. So you want to always apply your putty as soon as possible when it's fresh, because it's nice and sticky, and it's easier to kind of smooth down and just get into those basic forms. Once you let it set up, even for like 10 minutes, it's very different than when it first starts. So whether you're working in a small area or a large area, just get it all down as quickly as possible. And then if you want, you can actually set it aside for a couple minutes just to let it rest and set up. But make sure you do as much as possible when it's soft initially. So here I'm just kind of working on the form a little more, but at the same time sculpting the details. So I'm trying to level off that shape that kind of got a little too rounded as I kind of blobbed it up onto the pistol's barrel, and then just adding a little more angle to it, just a little more interesting shapes, kind of making it more of a, I don't know any of these official terms for guns. Trigger, barrel, handle, hammer, that's all I know. Cylinder. But anyways, there's just an extra little piece underneath that just kind of gives it a little more of interest. And I think I ended, so I realized that that piece was too large and bulky, so I kind of pressed it in and reformed it a bit, and then I had to retrim it. So that's what I'm talking about. Do as much as you can early on to get things into the proper shape, so you don't have to push and form it again and have to redo, you know, the details and work you've already done. So I need that front bottom area to set up a little more, so I went ahead and put on just a little element there. It's just basically a little triangle essentially to kind of look like the pistol's hammer. Now, one thing I didn't put on this pistol was a trigger, and you could do that. You could sculpt a little guard around the trigger or just the trigger. But the reason I didn't do that is because this will most likely just be placed in a figure's hand, and the trigger area will be completely obscured by the trigger finger. And it's also, for me, it's just easier to sculpt the hand on there holding it and then sculpt the trigger guard around the finger. Now, if you're going to have this as a completely separate piece, then you might want to go ahead and sculpt the trigger and the guard. That way, if you have it, in a holster or on the ground or in a bag, whatever, where you need to see all the details, then go ahead and put that on there. Save yourself some time. And here we are with the final pistol. As you can see, I cut in a few more details on the lower portion of the barrel, shaped it a little more, and all around I did a little bit more filing just to make sure everything was a little crisper, a little more squared up, and nicer looking, just to kind of give that last bit of polish. And from here, if there's any extra little details, you could pop those on as well. But this is where I want it to be, and I like how it turned out. Well, I hope that helped you see how you could go about sculpting your own pistols for sci-fi, fantasy, historicals. You could use these techniques to sculpt any kind of pistol for any genre. As always, I'd like to thank all my patrons for helping support these videos and making them possible. If you'd like to support the Mini Sculpting Super Show, head on over to the Patreon page yourself, check things out, and feel free to leave a comment down in the description. I love reading those and getting back with you guys. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget, keep sculpting.